Morning, everybody. Good to be with y'all this morning in our slow transition to fall. I was telling my family about this. I love, for the most part, our transition to fall is pretty slow. Most of the trees stay green, and then there's a little bit of yellow. But there's one type of tree that I can't quite identify, but every time it's like even the slightest bit below 70, that one type of tree is like, cool, and we're red and we're falling. This that overexcited like person is like, okay, time to go, and they're sprinting out the door to the car. Just okay, here we go. Yep.
If you like yellow, all you have to do is come to my street. The only house on the whole entire block, we got yellow leaves all over the front yard.
There you go.
But where they come from, nobody else has even got more leaves. They're all in my yard.
Yep. But yes, we starting to see the transition of seasons, one of the most colorful and very obvious transition of seasons, and it's just really cool how just the change in the weather can send living beings into, with the animals, they go into their dens to go to sleep for a while. With the trees, they shed their leaves, and it's just all part of this intricate and beautiful world that the Lord made for us. All right, well, we are going to continue our study of gospel personages. Thanks to Josh for coming in class last week. Did a wonderful job. Got to catch that on the YouTube replay. And so this week we're going to be in lesson 4, going to be studying Andrew. And as I'm doing my study of Andrew, I'm reading through the book and what it has to say and all these things, and you just come to realize the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about Andrew. Some facts that we do know are he's Peter's brother. That is mentioned many times. In fact, oftentimes the Bible cannot say the name Andrew without following it up with Peter's brother. He's very well known for being the brother of Peter because, Peter is kind of a big deal biblically. Not to discount from Andrew, but it is kind of funny that almost every time you read the name Andrew, it is preceded or followed by Peter's brother. We know that Andrew is not a Hebrew name. It's interesting that his brother Peter, we first meet Peter as Simon, son of John. And then he's taken to Jesus, and Jesus says, you will now be known as Cephas or Peter, which is a Greek or Arabic name, depending on which one you're looking at. But we always know Andrew as Andrew. He is not mentioned as anything else. Even when the Bible refers to Peter as Simon, it says Simon and his brother Andrew were fishing in the lake one day. And that's just really interesting. And in our reading example today, we might see a couple reasons why we only ever hear the Greek name of Andrew, but we know that Andrew is a offshoot of the Greek word andros or Andreas, which in Greek language means man, literally in the case of Andros, or Andreas means manly or brave or courageous. And so from our few context clues that this was probably a name given to Andrew as well as his Hebrew name, Andrew was probably either very large in either physical stature or emotional stature. He was given a name that literally means he was manly or courageous. And in the verses here, we're going to see that very much translates into the few actions that we get to see Andrew take. We got his name, we have his brother, and then we know he was a fisherman. We know that this was a fairly common practice, especially in the region where they lived, being right next to the Sea of Galilee, having lots of coastline, so there was always a need for people to literally take the fish out of the water and give to the people to eat. We know that him and Peter owned their own boat, owned their own equipment, and so that would speak to probably not fabulously wealthy, but enough to make money to buy their own equipment to keep their fishermen endeavors going. So, it's interesting then that when we first meet Andrew, we know that him and his brother are fishermen, but the first time we hear mention of Andrew is when he is a follower of John the Baptist. which we studied John the Baptist last week. So now we see, if we want to go into our first reading, if you want to open your books to the book of John, the book of John by far has the most. In fact, John is the only one who actually mentions Andrew in action. When Andrew is mentioned in the other books, it is the same words as John is going to get his brother Peter, or is just mentioned whenever they're listing out the 12 apostles. But John has a lot to say about Andrew's actions. So, first thing we're going to read is going to be in chapter 1. And if someone wants to read verses 35 through 41. John chapter 1, verses 35 through 41.
Again, the next day, after John stood, and two of his disciples, looking upon Jesus as he walked, he saith, Behold, the Lamb of God. And the two disciples turned to speak, and they followed Jesus. Then Jesus turned and saw them following, and said unto them, What seek ye? They said unto him, Rabbi, which is to say, being interpreted, Master, where dwellest thou? He saith unto them, Come and see. They came and saw where he dwelt and abode with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two which heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first bindeth his own brother Simon, and saith unto him, Ye have found the Messiah, which he is, being interpreted, the Christ.
All right. So, first example of Andrew. If you remember, previously with John the Baptist, John had been visited by a lot of different people. He had been asked questions by his own followers. The Pharisees sent representatives to talk to him, essentially saying, like, what you doing out here? Because he's going around teaching about, prophecies that the Hebrews would already know about. He quoted a lot of the old prophets, but also was baptizing. And so many people were questioning John, like, do you know what you're doing here? Are you sure about this path that you're taking? And so John is not used to being questioned, and yet here we see that John is standing there with his two disciples. One is Andrew, one is an unnamed disciple. But he says, Behold the Lamb of God. The two disciples heard him say this and said, All right, cool, let's go. And they just take off and start following Jesus, to the point where Jesus just kind of like notices these two guys following him, and he turns around and says, knowingly, he says, What is it you're looking for? And they said, Teacher, where are you staying? He says, Come with me. He doesn't give them a whole bunch of details. He doesn't really give them the game plan. He just says, they ask him where he's staying, and he says, Just follow me. And they do. Without question, without any kind of, you can't even tell us where we're going. They just hear John say, This is the Messiah. And they say, okay, we're going to follow that guy. And whenever Jesus stops to kind of take stock and say, what is it you're looking for? They don't tell him, we want to find the Messiah. We want to receive teaching. We want to be among your first. They just ask, where are you staying? And he says, follow me and you'll find out. And they do. And they don't just say, they use the term rabbi, which is very much a word with meaning. That's not just saying, hey, dude, we're going to come follow you. That is giving someone a title and in some ways almost giving power over them. They are establishing him as not just someone that might lead them to something better. They know. They address him as someone who knows more than they do. And so they start referring to him in this way, and they go to where he is staying. And so then we read, Andrew, after going to where Jesus is staying, essentially the next thing he does is go to his brother and say, and it's interesting, he doesn't just say, hey, we found this great teacher. We found this guy who really has it together. He just straight up says to Peter, we have found the Messiah. There's no alternate interpretation of the word Messiah that could mean great leader or something else. Messiah means the Christ. After following this guy for what is essentially half a day, he goes and finds his brother and says, "This is it, Peter. Simon, this is it. This is the guy they've been talking about. This is the guy John was talking about. This is the guy the prophets were alluding to in their prophecies." Like, from the get-go, Andrew has no doubt. This is Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. And just what a beautiful example of just not misguided naivety, but just absolute faith in someone that first, he has to have faith that John knows what he's talking about. And again, we have the blessing of hindsight. We get to read about this as it's already happened. We get to see the results. We get to see how things played out and how they ended. At the time of reading, Andrew is completely going off just faith. He is going off the fact that he is totally committed to John's teachings, and then by the next step, Jesus' teachings. So when he's told, this is Jesus Christ the Messiah, go with him wherever he goes and bring other people to him, he is snap ready to do exactly that. No questions, no tests, no doubts, which the apostles were not immune to. They weren't immune to doubting. They weren't immune to wanting to know more, wanting to really feel out what's going on. Andrew just steps to it. And so we are established right off the bat, Andrew is in. I mean, he's technically the first apostle. And even so, as big of a thing is that whenever Jesus is sitting with his apostles right before he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, he asks the apostles, "Who do the people say I am?" And they answer him, "Oh, some people think you're Elijah, some people think you're this and this." And then he asks them, "Who do you say I am?" And then Peter says, "You are Jesus Christ the Messiah." That is such a big moment. But we have to also keep in mind that Andrew, from day one, tells everybody, this is the Messiah. It's not a race. It's not one brother trying to outdo the other. But it's just kind of incredible that this guy was just totally committed from day one. Talk about courage. To just put your total faith in someone because of the teachings that you've been told. Any other thoughts about this section right here? All right, well, let's move into our next reading here. In the same book, John, we're going to go down to chapter 6. If someone wants to read verses 8 and 11.
Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish.
All right, so our second example of Andrew in action. And also the second example of Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. All the lead up to this is, Jesus is in the meat of his ministry, no pun intended. But now he has this large group following him. We're not just talking like a decent group of 30, 40 people, like a church gathering. This is the beginnings of an actual army. 5,000 they counted the men. We knew that women and children were there, but they weren't counted in the total of the 5,000. Just alone 5,000 men, that's an arena. That is like the lower levels of a football game, totally filled up. It's hard to think about that all being for one person, just to hear him speak, that much of a crowd had gathered there. And so, yeah, kind of in the similar ways to Jesus's first miracle, turning the water into wine, there was just a need for food. There was hunger, there was thirst, there was a lack of something. And here we see that they're trying to figure out what to do. And Andrew brings this boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. And with the examples that we've had of Andrew so far, he asks, but what are they among so many? I think he knew exactly how much they were among so many. I don't think Andrew brought this boy to Jesus out of desperation, out of like, well, he's the only person that has anything here. I think he saw this boy and he said, Jesus can work with this. And so he brings this kid, and he isn't the one who makes the miracle happen, but he's the one who goes, okay, yeah, watch this. Facing down 5,000 hungry people is a pretty terrifying prospect. We know how people get when they're hungry. They don't act rationally. They don't think with their minds, they think with their stomachs. And even if they're there to see the most esteemed teacher, the most well-spoken of person in the whole country, if someone's hungry, they're not going to have a pretty good opinion of the one who's keeping them from eating. And yet, Andrew, with the hungry mob outside, knows that if he just gives Jesus the very few materials he needs, that Jesus will be able to make something incredible happen. And so here again, we're seeing the faith of, this doesn't make sense in my own mind. This doesn't make physical sense in any kind of the logic, but I know that this guy is different. This is the Messiah, and he can do exactly what he needs to with even so little as 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. And just as Andrew probably predicted, Jesus feeds 5,000 plus with just a couple fish and some loaves of bread. And then our last example here, going over to chapter 12. Pretty short excerpt here, but the few pieces we get really start to kind of click together. John chapter 12, starting in verse 20. Let me get mine lined up here. No, not that bookmark. Technology always works until someone's looking. Okay, here we go. Now there were certain Greeks among those who had came up to worship at the feast. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip came and told Andrew, and in turn Andrew and Philip told Jesus. Very, very, very short excerpt here. But it's interesting that the details that we get from this kind of plan out why it was mentioned at all. There were Greeks coming up to worship at the feast being in Jerusalem, and them wanting to see Jesus. These are Greeks. These are not people that would normally be making this trip up to Jerusalem to participate in a Jerusalem custom, in a Jewish custom. We see that they knew who Jesus was, and we see that the word is no longer just contained within the one region where Jesus had taught. The word is getting out, y'all. And now there are people coming from different countries where Judaism is not the main religion, is not the main practice. These Greeks are coming from a country where they believe in about 27 and a half different gods for each aspect of nature and the way that things work. And yet they're coming from there because they want to see Jesus. They're not there. They're not there on a cultural experience. They're not there to, oh, let's see what those Hebrews are up to. They specifically want to see Jesus. And in other times where people come to see Jesus, and a lot of sometimes his followers, not necessarily the apostles, but the other folks who have been with Jesus for a while are saying like, no, give him his space. Like, don't overcrowd him. I mean, the example of like the children wanting to come to Jesus, and even some of the apostles saying, no, come on, give him a space. Philip and Andrew hear these Greeks very much outside of the usual crowd that they're experiencing, and they say, hey, we want to see Jesus. And Philip and Andrew go, yeah, okay. Because at this point, the apostles are pretty on the same wavelength of, they're no longer thinking like, oh, only the certain people get to see Jesus. They now know everybody needs to hear this. This isn't just a message for one strict area. We need to just help everybody get to see this guy. Because again, some of the apostles came to the idea of the Messiah a little quicker than others. But it is good that Andrew is one of them, because Andrew, as we've seen, is the one who's going to go, yeah, no, right over here. They go straight to Jesus and they tell him, these folks want to see you. And we don't get to see exactly how that interaction takes place, but we don't need to, because we know that there now is no pushback to people seeking Jesus. And it sets an example for our evangelism today. If someone comes and asks about the Bible, we don't need to know the reason. We don't need to know where they came from, how they got here, what specifically they want to learn. If someone is seeking out the Word of God, we should be tripping over ourselves to get a Bible and to sit down and have that chat with them. Because Andrew didn't face down, was met by people he didn't know, from country he may or may not have even been to, but he knew about the other practices of their Greek pantheon there, and he didn't question. He didn't think about it for a while. Him and Philip went straight to Jesus and said, all right, these folks are here to see you. And so here is kind of where our, I guess, biblical knowledge of Andrew kind of ends. But we know that the spirit of how he carried himself, the spirit of how he addressed others in the context of Jesus, has inspired so many. In other denominations, Andrew is the patron saint of missionaries. And yes, non-canon and all that other stuff. But for a man who has so little mentioning in the Bible of his actual actions, for people to recognize that he had the spirit of a missionary, he had the spirit of evangelism, to revere him in such a way really says something. And while we don't need to have a little statue of Andrew in our house whenever we go on mission trips or anything like that, we absolutely can keep the spirit of Andrew in our minds when we think about mission work. Because Andrew's affinity for reaching out to others, for spreading the word, was both very close reaching in his own region, in his own area, literally within his own family. He brings Peter to Jesus. Without Andrew, we don't, obviously the Lord's plan is always carried out, but in the context of this right here, without Andrew, Peter doesn't get a direct line to Jesus. And thankfully, we don't have to think that way, but Andrew plays a major part in Jesus' ministry, because he is the epitome of a missionary. He goes and tells his family. He goes and tells people. He helps feed people that are there to see the person he's working for, and he helps with outreach to people from other countries. And so it's very easy to see why he is revered as such. Any other thoughts? Any other examples of Andrew? Yeah.
Sometimes I think our greatest work may be those that we lead to Christ.
Mm.
When you look at Andrew,
The man who is almost exclusively referred to as the brother of this person. Yeah, that's why it's such a big deal. He brought Peter to Jesus. He was a missionary to Peter, the guy who becomes one of the main figureheads, leader of the church after Jesus' crucifixion. And he does it in such a simple way, but it's such a powerful way, isn't it? Yeah.
I'd like to go back to where he was with John the Baptist. Even though he was a fisherman, you know that he had to have some learning of the scripture. Because when he came to John and listened to him, he was evidently affected by that. And then just for him to say, the Lamb of God, you know, and he immediately goes to find out about this man, stays with him for half a day. Whatever they talked about, we don't know. It wasn't given to us. But after their half a day talk, he went to get his brother, like you said, with great faith that this is the Messiah. So even though he was a fisherman, basically saying an unlearned person, he had to have known some of the scriptures to know that this Messiah was coming and he was looking for it.
Yeah.
Too.
Same way in our study of Mary, how we don't have the context that she daily followed the practices that are set out by the law, but for her to be revered in such a way and talked with such high regard from an angel, we can use that context to make inferences about the people that we study. And yeah, for him to be with John the Baptist, I think about the fact that it was just him and another guy standing with John. That means he was probably in one of John's most avid followers. For everyone else to be gone, and yet it's just him, another guy, and John. That speaks a lot. Without us needing any conversation, any character development that might happen with being able to hear the conversations, just being there speaks 1,000 words. And yeah, just like our study today, his simple, just faithful actions speak more than any kind of teaching, any kind of speeches that he might have given. We don't need to know that because Andrew speaks very clearly with how he carries himself. Yeah.
Also, you said he was looking. He was looking for this person. I think we need to apply that to our own lives as Christians. We need to be looking for Christ to come back, and we need to make sure we're ready. I can remember the night that my father passed away. That's the thing he said about the sermon that was preached that day. You know, Donna, that was my mother. We just have to be ready.
Yeah. Andrew was prepared. He didn't need to pack his things up before. John said, "That's the guy." He said, "That's where I'm going." Yeah, and so, yeah, tying things into what we take from Andrew's example, how we move that into our own lives is, yeah, ultimately, Andrew shows us our physical things are the things we own, our homes. That ultimately is just a temporary comfort that we have. Whenever we see that there's a need, we should be running to fill that need. It might be here in Madison, it might be in a different country, but just like Andrew, we have to be ready to help in whatever way we can. Any other thoughts of Andrew? Yeah?
People pray, you know, to go to the mission field. They wind up in Madison, Wisconsin, in the middle of December with an 18-inch snowfall. So many of them are ready to say, I'm going back south, I'm not staying here. So be sure what you pray for and mean it.
Yeah. It's not just being prepared, it's being prepared for anything. Yeah. The conditions shouldn't matter. It makes things difficult. Jesus never said that the Christian life was an easy one, free of any kind of discomfort. And so that also carries into being prepared for any kind of mission work. Yeah. It might be buried under the snow in Madison, Wisconsin. It might be in the sweltering heat of Dallas, Texas. Wherever you are, you can take comfort in knowing that this is just the comfort and the discomfort are all temporary. Because all of that leads to paradise. It leads to being with Jesus and the Lord in heaven. Yeah?
To me, that kind of is the reason why God has made people with a lot of different likes, capabilities, and that, because if we were all made the same, we'd all be in the same place at the same time.
Right.
You need to get people that got that under their belt. I gotta get over there and get some of this stuff done. They need it.
Right.
That's another thing I always wondered, it's kind of a fun thing, but did anybody ever take the gospel above the Arctic Circle? And do we have any of those Eskimos that have really been taught about the church? Because people are more comfortable in more comfortable surroundings.
Right.
That would be a very, probably at the very top end of the worst part of the world to go do that.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things that just run through your mind.
Right.
once in a while.
And, Paul talks about, in the Bible, we talk about some of you should not become teachers. Some of you have affinities for this. That is very much the case. Some people aren't meant to physically go out and teach in places. But there are different ways that you can help. Everyone has spiritual gifts, and we don't all have the same spiritual gifts. Andrews was being the person to go and talk to someone and say, come talk to this guy. But then other people are just meant for different things, whether that's funding the missionaries, whether that's being the missionaries, whether that's feeding the missionaries. There's so many different aspects, and yet there is a place where you can fit in, where you can fill that role. Just because you can't do one certain role doesn't make you less of a Christian than that person who can do that role. Because just like in the world today, people doing different jobs, people who do plumbing, people who serve your food, people who work with computers, if you take away one of those aspects, it becomes immensely more difficult to do the rest of those jobs. Without missionaries, it becomes very hard to spread the word. However, if those missionaries have nothing to eat, it becomes really hard to spread the word of the Lord. So yeah, don't ever think less of yourself just because you're not the person who doesn't physically go to another country. Just know that the little bit that you're doing is a game changer. And as long as you are finding ways to use your skills to help those around you, that is the important part. Doesn't matter how much, doesn't matter where. As long as you are taking the time to support those around you in whatever ways that works for you, that is mission work. Yeah.
On the same level of importance, and sometimes even more, is not just the spiritual gifts, but the fruits of the Spirit. Just what you're demonstrating and putting out there to show Jesus to others without even having to do anything sometimes. It's just being patient and kind and You know, all the fruits of the Spirit have a high importance in how we are as Christians and how we display.
Yeah. If you go and you list out the fruits of the Spirit, there's none of those that you can go, we probably don't need that one. It's the least important of these: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are things that you need. You cannot leave out gentleness. You cannot leave out patience. All of the fruit of the Spirit, come together to make a complete Christian. And so, being an example of those things, you might not be a missionary, but you might be raising the next missionary in how you treat them, in how you raise them, in how you interact with them. Because they'll see those aspects that you have, and they'll want to be that way too. All right, we're getting close to our cutoff time, but just a fun little aside of completely non-canon biblical examples of Andrew. It's interesting to see that there are lots of apocryphal writings, which is like biblical times but not of the Bible, that we don't hold up as actual things that happened, but there are multiple writings. There is an Acts of Andrew. That is a non-canon biblical writing that, to most philosophers, is essentially a Christian retelling of Homer's The Odyssey. Andrew goes on this great trip across the sea to a faraway land where he seeks to help people that are down on their luck, that need support and help, and he goes and he preaches to them and uplifts them and eventually comes back. But again, not canon, but to inspire such stories, to realistically be thought of as a heroic character in non-biblical writings, that speaks a lot as well. And just because something isn't canon to the Bible doesn't mean that we can take lessons from it. It's important that we realize this is not biblical, this is not something that might have actually happened, but again, it just speaks to the character of Andrew. Yeah.
Doesn't matter if we're talking to one, or we're talking to 5,000, or we're in the chain up to the person who can get the correct information.
Right.
Which kind of covers all three sections of the verses we read this morning. You can be part of that chain, whether you're the instructor, whether you're instructing many, or whether you need to go find somebody and teach the person that.
Absolutely. Andrew knew he couldn't feed 5,000 with some bread and fish, but he knew someone who could. And so he takes that person right to Jesus. Yeah, sometimes if you don't feel comfortable, if you don't feel like you have the knowledge to help this person to the fullest, then there is no shame in saying, hey, you know what? I have my elder at church, I have my minister, I have this person who I've learned from, who I know can answer your questions a lot better than I can. And you give them their contact info. Or maybe if the need arises, you drive them to that person's house. But yeah, no shame in going and find someone if you don't quite know the answer. Yeah, excellent point. Well, we're just about 2 minutes out, but unless there's any other final wrapping up thoughts or things we want to say. All right. Thank you all for a wonderful class.